Hello, my name is David Williamson. I'm the pastor of Zionsville United Methodist Church, and this is the third video, an installment of videos I'm creating to share how I read the Bible in relation to same-sex marriage. Thanks for watching this far into the series. I want to be clear that my intent with these videos is not to attack or provoke anyone who might hold a different view of Scripture than myself. I have great respect for many pastors and leaders who hold a traditional viewpoint, even if it's not a position I share. I'm thankful to everyone who has helped to shape my understanding, including the many traditionalist brothers and sisters with whom I've debated over the years. So far, we've looked at a few key passages from the Old Testament, the story of creation and the law of Leviticus. For this video, we turn to the ministry of Jesus. First, we need to note that Jesus didn't address homosexuality. It was not a primary question that his culture put before him, nor was it a question, for that matter, that was put before Paul or any other New Testament writers. They each addressed questions that their culture prompted: how to live in relation or separation from pagan worship cults, how to treat the poor and vulnerable in their midst, how to live in peace with the Roman government. As we discussed in the first video, as culture changes, it sets before us different questions, some of which the Bible was not explicitly written to address. Our job is to faithfully and carefully consider what to bind and loose, what is required for faithful living, and which requirements do not reflect the will and character of God. Now, just because Jesus did not address homosexuality does not mean that Jesus endorsed it. It is important for us to remember, though, that Jesus' primary ministry was to those who are marginalized and excluded. This included lepers, tax collectors, prostitutes, all of whom were considered sinners or unclean. Jesus kept table fellowship with them. He attended their parties. He hung out with them. It's one of the chief attacks his opponents made against him. So there is no doubt in my mind that Jesus would be seeking out in our world today those who have felt excluded and cut off from the church, especially those in the LGBTQ community. As we said in the first video, Jesus both bound and loosened the covenant. He preached and modeled grace, but he called his followers to love and righteousness. Probably the best example I can give of this is John chapter 8, the story of the woman who was caught in adultery and brought before Jesus. Now, the law was clear on this matter. Leviticus 20:10 reads, "If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death." Interesting enough, in this moment, the man was not brought before Jesus, only the woman. Now, the primary intent of the scribes and Pharisees who brought the woman to Jesus was not covenant keeping. They just wanted to entrap Jesus. Would he excuse her sin, or would he uphold the law? Jesus paused for a while. He wrote something in the ground with his finger, and then he stood and said, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to cast a stone." And one by one, everyone in the crowd dropped their stones and returned home. When Jesus was finally alone with the woman, he asked her, "Does no one condemn you?" "No one, sir," she replied. "Then neither do I condemn you." A beautiful story of grace. And then Jesus added, "Go and sin no more." Jesus defended her from the consequences of her actions, but he also called her in freedom to turn away from the lifestyle that had put her in that vulnerable place to begin with. Now, broadly speaking, progressives want to put the emphasis on Jesus' pronouncement of grace, "Neither do I condemn you." And traditionalists remind them of the next statement, "Go and sin no more." Now, while Jesus didn't address the topic of same-sex marriage, he was asked about marriage, specifically the topic of divorce. We find the story in Matthew 19. As with the story from John 8, this story is prompted by experts in the law who want to entrap Jesus. They begin by posing this question while Jesus is teaching the crowds: "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause?" Let me make a couple observations about the question itself. First, the scribe asks, "Is it lawful?" Mosaic law did not explicitly forbid divorce. We can find Deuteronomy 24, that's the key passage. It says, "If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce." So divorce is allowed. Then the second observation, he says, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" The man was completely in control of this process. A man could divorce his wife, but she could not divorce him. And once divorced, a woman was extremely vulnerable in that society. She couldn't work. She couldn't own property of her own. She had to return to her father's household to be cared for. She might remarry, although that wasn't likely because she had already been defiled. In fact, if you keep reading the passage in Deuteronomy 24, the law continues. If a woman has been divorced, but then married to another man, and then subsequently divorced or widowed, she could not return to her first husband because she'd been defiled by the second marriage. For that man to remarry her would be an abomination. Remember that word we talked about in our first video? This is another example where it describes something that we might not see as as an ethical failing, but rather a cultural taboo that no longer applies today. So, back to the question. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? That's the key phrase. Because Deuteronomic law contained two phrases. A woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her. There was a long debate between rabbis about those two phrases. Strict rabbis would say only an affair would provide just cause because he found something indecent about her. Liberal rabbis would say anything displeasing would be enough. No matter how Jesus replied, those experts in the law were prepared to pigeonhole him and to attack, discredit him after he replied. But Jesus didn't debate the law. He didn't reference Deuteronomy 24 at all. Instead, he went all the way back to the creation story, which we considered in last week's video. Have you not read, he said, that the one who made them male and female in the beginning also said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one put asunder. Bet you always wonder where that pronouncement at the end of weddings came from. Jesus appealed to God's intent for marriage, that two should become one, living in covenant partnership together. Divorce is not God's intent. It was only allowed in the law because of our hard-heartedness. So Jesus concluded then, whoever divorces his wife and marries another, except in cases of unchastity, commits adultery, which can be a hard word for anyone who has experienced divorce. Jesus answered the Pharisees' question. Divorce could be allowed in cases of unchastity. But there's a crucial shift that's taking place here. The Pharisees were asking how to justify divorce. Jesus wanted instead to affirm the covenant of marriage, the miracle of two becoming one. And in his answer, Jesus was also protecting the vulnerable. If you, as a husband, set aside your wife for no reason except to seek out a new, more pleasing wife, then you're committing great harm. Now, when the disciples heard Jesus' reply, they remarked, if such is the case, it's better not to marry. And in response to them, Jesus acknowledged that there are those who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of God's kingdom. It was a euphemism for those who chose celibacy as a way of honoring and serving God. Jesus respected singleness. He himself never married. But he also held a high view of both the blessing and purpose of marriage. So the question follows. If Jesus condemned divorce and remarriage, then why do we commonly accept this in the church today? Well, there's a variety of reasons. First, we live in a different culture. The institution of marriage is different. Women in our society have more rights. And some of the prohibitions around divorce in the Old Testament might have been about protecting the vulnerable, not just punishing those in unhappy marriages. Secondly, we believe in a God of grace, a God of second chances. Those who've gone through divorce have experienced great hurt, and we don't want to compound that pain by barring them forever from experiencing the joy of sharing love again with a covenant partner. Ultimately, we believe the covenant of marriage is a means of grace, a way of experiencing God's love and blessing by sharing that love and blessing with another. We affirm that the covenant of marriage is good, even for those who've experienced that covenant being previously broken. Now, I wholeheartedly agree with all these reasons for loosing the prohibitions around remarriage. I've known many who've been blessed in a second marriage, whose remarriage has been not just a blessing to them, but to their families and all who know them. I cannot help but look at those marriages as being in line with God's goodwill intent for their lives. But I would also point out every single reason I just gave in support of remarriage could also be made on behalf of those who desire to marry a partner of the same sex. We live in a different culture from when the Bible was written, with a different understanding of human sexuality and marriage and individual rights. We believe in a God of grace. We affirm marriage as a way of knowing and growing in God's grace. And we don't want to compound the hurt that the LGBTQ community has experienced by barring them from this commitment. It's worth reflecting on the question of how we've made peace with the idea of remarriage, which Jesus explicitly forbade, and yet we are splitting over the question of same-sex marriage, which Jesus did not address. We must ask in all humility if there is some fear or prejudice in play that's caused us to loosen one command but bind the other. In the end, Jesus held the covenant of marriage to a high standard, and this was true of Jesus' ministry in general. He extended grace to others, especially to the excluded and marginalized, but he always held his followers to a high standard, perhaps the highest of which was the great commandment itself, to love God with all our hearts, all our minds, all our strength, and all our souls, and to love our neighbor, including the stranger and our enemy, just as we have loved ourselves. That remains the North Star, on which I think we can all agree, and which I continue to call our church to follow. In our next video, we'll turn to Paul's letter to the Romans, and we'll see what he has to say about this same high standard of love.